everyone. My name is Marion Fourcade, and I am the Director of Social Science Matrix at UC Berkeley. I am very pleased today to welcome you to our panel, Truth and Denial, Searching for Information in the Digital Era. This is an event that is co-sponsored with the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, and so we are very grateful to Dean Geeta Anand for making it possible as well. And it's really a unique conversation between academics and journalists that I hope we will do again in the future. We will have again in the future. So for those of you who are new to Matrix, we are a cross-disciplinary social science research institute at UC Berkeley. Today's event is part of our On Point series, a series devoted to panel discussions on important matters of the moment. So before we get started, I just want to highlight two upcoming events in May. On May 7, we will have a Matrix book salon on the book Race to the Bottom, How Racial Appeals Work in American Politics by Lafleur Stephens-Dugan, who is assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Princeton University. And on May 14th, we have another Matrix on Point titled Americans' Pursuit of Racial Justice, where the panelists will discuss a critical momentum of the Black Lives Matter movement this past year, and they will situate it in the larger historical context in the United States. So now, without further ado, let me introduce our distinguished moderator, David Barstow. David, I don't know if you can turn on your video. Great, wonderful. So David Barstow is the head of investigative reporting at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. He's also a former senior writer at the New York Times and the first reporter to ever win 4 Pulitzer Prizes. Named the Reva and David Logan Distinguished Chair in Investigative Journalism in July 2019, Barstow joined the Times in 1999 and has been a member of the paper's investigative unit since 2002. He's the recipient of 4 Polk Awards, the Goldsmith Prize, the Alfred I. Dupont Silver Baton, the Bartlett and Steele Gold Medal, and the Loeb Award, among many awards. And I'm sorry for butchering some of these names. So David, thank you so much for moderating this wonderful panel. And I will turn over to you for the opening statement and the panelist introductions.
Thank you so much, Marion, for that introduction. I'm so happy to be here. 4 or 5 years ago, a friend of mine called me up. He was full of outrage. He had just read an article that had come to him in his Facebook feed that described how Barack Obama's mother-in-law was going to get a $160,000 federal pension for life because she had babysat the Obama children in the White House during the Obama years. And he was absolutely livid that something like this could occur. Now, this friend of mine is someone who I knew to be extremely a huge consumer of news and information, highly educated, professional, and he was absolutely livid. And I asked him, wait, that doesn't sound right. That sounds very strange. Can you read me the article? And he read it to me, and it actually sounded like it walked and talked like an actual news article. It cited sources. It mentioned the Freedom of Information Act. And then I said to him, well, could you send me the link? This sounds so strange. Can you send me the link? And he sent me the link. And it was only then that I realized something was really wrong. And it was because the link was from a news site called the BostonTribune.com. And only because I'm from Boston and I know the news ecosystem in Boston, I knew there was no such thing as the BostonTribune.com. And of course, it turned out this was a completely fake, made up news site. And for me, this was one of the big aha moments about just how pernicious the epidemic of disinformation has become in our society, the way in which it had reached even someone who I knew is not someone who could be easily fooled by something like this. And of course, we all know that in the years since, this problem has only grown so much worse. And the easiest way, I think, to think about that, or the way I think about that, is through the prism of the big lie, which we're all now grappling with. The big lie that that the 2020 presidential election was stolen. And when we think about how rapidly the big lie spread and how deeply it's embedded in certainly the Republican base at this point, that feels like it should be an impossibility. Every single fact checker who looked at this said this was nonsense. There were scores and scores of articles in every one of the major news organizations looked at this carefully and said this is nonsense. 60 lawsuits, we all know, many of them decided by a Republican judge rejecting this allegation. William Barr, who had set up a special unit in the Justice Department to look for fraud, came out and said there's no evidence of widespread fraud. Mitch McConnell, for heaven's sake, said on the Senate floor that these were wild falsehoods. And yet, here we are, 2 weeks ago, there was a Reuters and Ipsos poll that came out that showed that 6 in 10 Republicans today believe that the election was stolen. And half of Republicans think that what happened on January 6th was basically the act or the operation of left-wing activists. And so we really can see with our own eyes just how pernicious this problem has grown. And we're now watching state legislatures all over the country passing legislation about voting, and often on the basis of these falsehoods. So I'm so thrilled that we have this panel today to help us sort through this, this mess that we're in. And I hope and pray potentially point us toward a more hopeful future, or with some ideas at least about what we can do to combat this epidemic of disinformation. And so let me please introduce them without further ado, and then we'll hear their presentations. First, I want to introduce you to Francesca Tripodi, who is an assistant professor at the UNC School of Information and Library Science and a senior faculty researcher with the Center for Information, Technology, and Public Life. Dr. Tripodi is a sociologist and media scholar whose research examines the relationship between social media, political partisanship, and democratic participation, revealing how Google and Wikipedia are manipulated for political gains. She also, by the way, studies patterns of gender inequality on Wikipedia, shedding light on how knowledge is contested in the 21st century. And her research has been covered by the Washington Post, the New York Times, the New Yorker, among many others. Next, we have Sunha Han, who is an assistant professor of communication at Simon Fraser University and author of Technologies of Speculation, The Limits of Knowledge in a Data-Driven Society, published by NYU Press in 2020. And his book asks, what counts as knowledge in the age of big data? And how are our bodies made into facts through the growing ubiquity of surveillance and tracking technologies? His research asks how new media and its data become invested with the ideals of precision, objectivity, and truth. And he has been published in journals such as Surveillance and Society and First Monday. And then last but not least, we have Kevin Roos, who is a fabulous tech columnist for the New York Times and the New York Times best-selling author of 3 books, including Futureproof, 9 Rules for Humans in the Age of Automation, which is a guide to surviving the technological future. Can't wait to hear more about that. He is also the host of Rabbit Hole, a New York Times podcast about the many ways the internet is influencing our beliefs and behavior. He writes and speaks on automation and AI, social media, disinformation and cybersecurity and digital wellness. I don't know how he has time to sleep. And he, by the way, recently received spotlight for selling a digital version of his column on the rise of non-fungible tokens on the NFT market for over $700,000. Gosh, I really wish that I had thought of that idea first. But by the way, Kevin, being the good guy that he is, donated all of that money to the New York Times Neediest Cases Fund. So I'm so thrilled to have these three amazing experts on this subject come together to give a talk. We'll hear each of them give a presentation, and then we'll do some Q&A at the end. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Francesca.
Great, thank you so much, David. That was a wonderful introduction, both of us and of what we're here for today. So I'm a professor, so I made some slides, and mostly there to give us a little something visual to look at and help guide me, make sure I stay on track here. So I hope everyone can see these, and if not, someone will hopefully let me know. But as David mentioned, my name is Francesca Tripodi, and I'm an assistant professor in the School of Information and Library Science and a senior researcher at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at UNC Chapel Hill. And for the last decade, I've been using ethnographic methods to better understand how communities use platforms in ways unintended by programmers, exposing what researchers refer to as socio-technical vulnerabilities. And there's been a growing consensus that social media platforms influence the democratic process. But despite the significant role that information seeking plays in informing voters, limited attention has been paid to the importance of web search. Now, I think this is really important because Google handles around 3.8 million searches around the globe every minute. And users often conceive of a search engine as a place to discover new knowledge, even though plenty of researchers have shown us that big tech limits what we see, what we buy, and who we interact with. So while a great deal of work has studied the way big tech filters outputs or our returns, little research has sought to understand the way inputs also drive and determine the kind of information that we receive and the kind of information search engines will return. So my current work is focused on just that. How do our social interactions shape how, what, and when we search? And how are our keywords coded with pre-existing biases? Understanding the social dimensions of search sheds light on how platforms like Google and Wikipedia can be exploited for political gain, and how inequality manifests itself in information systems. So search engines play a huge role in our everyday lives. And I documented a lot of this in my ethnographic work around the 2017 governor's race in the state of Virginia. So during this primary, I traveled to various polling places, and I asked voters as they left the polling, where did they go for news that they could trust? And quite frankly, most people told me they just don't trust the news. And so I followed up with them and I asked, well, how did you learn about the candidate that you just voted for? And one simple phrase came up over and over. I Googled it. So after hearing this response a couple times in a row, I tried digging further. Well, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean you Googled it? And this question was often met with silence or confusion or blank stares. My favorite was an elderly woman who really looked at me with concern in her eyes while she typed on an Air keyboard and said very slowly, well, I took the names of the candidates and put them into Google. And she was very worried, I think, about my health. But when I asked, like, what then? What happens after you put them into Google? Most voters just didn't understand the question I was asking. And as my study unfolded, I realized part of why my question wasn't resonating was because most of us just don't really think about what happens after we put this into the search bar, especially when we go to search engines to fact check something. So as a young journalist who graduated from college just a few years before my study explained to me, I literally type it into Google. I read the first 3 or 5 articles that pop up because those are the ones that are obviously the most clicked on and the most read. And what my respondents said about Google was common. People in my study weighted the content at the top as more important, more relevant, and in many cases, the most accurate. Now, how information is ordered and whether or not you glean truth from it isn't particularly concerning when the subject you're Googling has like lots of accurate information. So an example I took is looking for information about the social science matrix. If you were looking up, what is this? Say you saw the thing online and you thought, well, let me see what this is about. A quick search for information about the social science matrix yields relatively accurate results, right? The first return is a website for the organization, but it also has videos and publications of people who have spoke in conjunction with it or who are affiliated with it. But it gets more complicated when the information we're seeking is embedded in what Arlie Hochschild refers to as our deep stories, the ones we've heard and told ourselves for so long that they already feel like truth. Because search engines are complex algorithms, and they're designed to generate a rank list of results based on what they think best matches our queries. Now, these results are dependent on a variety of factors. For example, our geolocation, the surrounding text, click-through data of other users, but they're also largely driven by our keywords. And the point of view with which an individual sees the world shapes the kinds of keywords they choose when searching. And these ideological fissures are essentially creating multiple internets, fueled by confirmation bias. So in many ways, we shape our reality because we're teaching Google what we want to see and what we consider to be credible sources of information. And those lessons are then fed back to us based on the same paradigm. Take, for example, immigration in the United States. Does your deep story connect immigration to the American dream? Is it one that welcomes foreign-born persons and advocates for their rights? Or is your deep story one that feels threatened by the arrival of foreigners and is concerned by what they will do to your vision of the United States? If you seek out information about, for example, illegal alien voter fraud, you're going to get very different returns than if you seek out information about, say, immigrant voting rights. So as you can see here, illegal alien voter fraud is producing content by ICE back in 2000. And immigrant voting rights is sharing more organizations designed to support the right for foreigners to vote in elections. The other thing I think is really important to take from this is that it's not just exclusive to Google. So I use Google a lot as my go-to example because it's quite frankly what drives most of our queries. And it's funny because oftentimes after hearing my talk, people will say, well, this is why I use DuckDuckGo. And I would say, it's not the search engine, it's the keyword. And so something I just want to quickly show is these same returns run in DuckDuckGo. So if you use an even simpler search using ideologically opposed keywords, illegal aliens in North Carolina versus undocumented workers in North Carolina, as you'll see, the search query ultimately returns siloed-like sources. So searching for something like illegal aliens produces content primarily within the right-wing media ecosystem, the Daily Caller, Breitbart, etc. And undocumented workers is looking at organizations that are designed to support undocumented rights. Now, the fact that we often go to search in confirmation of what we already believe gets even more complicated now that Google is changing how they order information. So in the information sciences, there's a difference between searching for content and searching for documents. And when Google first started, it facilitated a search for documents. It was acting like an intermediary, directing users to documents where they thought your information would be found. But it's still putting a lot of that agency and onus on the user. So you can see here, if I looked for Berkeley, California, the information on the right, a series of hyperlinks, berkeley.edu, cityofberkeley.info. This is still that information focus where it's facilitating a set of documents and putting it on me to go through them. But Google is slowly replacing a list of hyperlinked websites with a knowledge graph. And this is that box on the right? So where you see Berkeley and it's trying to essentially answer the question for us. It's allowing the search engine to provide the information directly and not simply aid in our personal inquiry. Now, this can be problematic because sometimes Google isn't giving us the right information. And my favorite example actually comes from Sam Weinberg, who is the Margaret Jacks Professor of Education at Stanford University and the creator and director of Stanford's History Education Group. So Sam and I were talking, and he said, I think my favorite example of this is when you Google the following phrase: who fired the first shot at Lexington? Or you could also query, who fired the first shot in the American Revolutionary War? And since I know we're all joining by computer, I would like to give you a few seconds to go ahead and do that for yourself. For our non-US guests that are joining us, this is a reference to the moment that historians refer to as the beginning of the Revolutionary War. And for those who may not be right next to Google, I'll show you the answer. According to Google, the answer is the British. Who fired the first shot at Lexington? Or if you Google who fired the first shot in the Revolutionary War, they answer it for you, British. But what's interesting is that we actually have no idea who fired the first shot. And what's more interesting is if you go the documentary site, right? By searching for documents, if you do in fact click on this resource, you'll see in the resource itself, to this day, no one knows which side fired first. Now, examples like these reveal the vulnerabilities of search, because it's pretty easy to trick an algorithm into thinking something's relevant and thinking something's right. And the ease by which you can trick the system is connected to what researchers refer to as a data void. When there is limited or no content available on a topic, it's easy to coordinate around terms to guarantee that future searches will direct to content that includes these terms. And this is how conspiracy theorists were able to capitalize on the concept of a crisis actor. By producing a plethora of insidious content and maximizing search engine optimization, conspiracy theorists filled the void, guaranteeing that future searchers were linked to these conspiratorial results. This is something that QAnon is actually doing relatively well. And during our panel, I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A. But because search engines are not designed to guide us through existential crises or challenge our existing beliefs, results are rooted in whether or not a system thinks it best matches what you're looking for. But the problem is relevance is ultimately subjective, idiosyncratic, hard to predict, and extremely unstable. And most importantly, it's exploitable. By knowing and understanding the concerns of their audiences and amplifying certain key phrases that resonate with their deep stories, content producers can drive users to seek out more information on Google and YouTube, knowing they are gameable systems. And I first considered the ideological role of search when reading Noble's Algorithms of Oppression. She talks about how Dylan Roof was searching on Google for concepts like Black on white crime, and how these key words connected him to the Council of Conservative Citizens. And what I started to think about is, well, maybe media manipulators are exploiting search engines, honing in on these keywords and phrases in order to maximize exposure of their ideas and connect to like-minded audiences through these deep stories. And what I found is that by encouraging their audiences to do their own research, a practice that resonates with conservatives who value individualism, and simultaneously repeating key words and phrases within their media content, the right-wing media ecosystem is able to create a highly effective propaganda feedback loop. Now, these findings were featured in a piece of investigative reporting by the Washington Post all the way many years ago now, who found that by typing Russia collusion into Google, it started autofilling delusion. And as I noted in this article, the phrase collusion delusion was first used by Roger Stone when he was interviewed on Fox News. And then this phrase began circulating throughout the right-wing media ecosystem. But I also saw it play out in real time during the first impeachment trial of former President Trump, when Representative Nunes used his time in the opening remarks to indicate that we shouldn't be thinking about what Trump is on trial for. What we should be paying attention to is the collusion hoax, Christopher Steele, and more importantly, Nellie Orr. Now, Nellie Orr is an excellent example of a political data void. And whether or not you know who she is largely predicated on who you voted for in 2020. So Nellie Orr works for Fusion GPS and is the wife of the former high-ranking justice official Bruce Orr. According to conspiracy theory that started on QAnon, their relationship is evidence that investigations into Donald Trump were part of a systematic effort by liberals to unlawfully remove him from office. And since 2017, searching for Nellie Orr on Google or YouTube returns links or videos from sources like Fox News, Fox Business, The Daily Caller, the Washington Examiner. Not a single, now I've been searching this key phrase for years, and not a single non-conservative link has yet to exist in the first 7 hits, largely because conservative media producers' discussion of her is exclusive. It's asymmetrical. The search for Nellie Orr essentially exists in an ideological vacuum. It's a keyword that was curated among the right-wing media ecosystem to act as a dog whistle and symbolize that the impeachment of Donald Trump is tenement to a witch hunt. So typically after writing or speaking about my work, I'm often asked, like, what now? How can we fix this? Or how can Google fix this? And I think that asking how we fix this problem is really asking the wrong question. We need to stop thinking about misinformation as a bug in the code. And instead we need to start thinking more about how search is a sociological issue, one that we can potentially circumvent, but only if we know and understand the kinds of questions people are seeking answers to. Because if we don't, this whole part of the internet will continue to be invisible to most of us. So thank you very much for your time. I am going to put another really quick plug in here and let you know that if today's topics are of interest to you, right now CTAP is doing an open call for graduate students and faculty to become affiliates with the center, and I would encourage you to check out our website for information for how to connect with us.
Thank you so much, Francesca. That was so fascinating and terrifying. And poor Nellie Orr. Oh my gosh. Just a quick reminder before we turn it over to Sun Ha for his presentation. Please don't be shy about asking questions in the Q&A feature that should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I'll be looking at those questions coming in and trying to get as many of those questions to our panelists as possible in the after conversation. So without any more ado here, Sun Ha, it's over to you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Francesca. I'll just share my screen and get started here. Just let me know if you can't see that. But so I would like to start I'll pick it up from Francesca's talk, actually. And I'll pick it up from this idea that many of us Google the truth in this kind of automated, technologically shaped way in rejection of, right? That's the other half of it, right? There's this active rejection of the legitimacy of the news media or the mainstream media. And I don't disagree with that at all, but I want to add maybe an interesting element to this. I want to begin with an intriguing argument that was just actually written just yesterday from Joshua Benton at the Nieman Lab. This idea that the point that he wanted to make is that actually it seems like many Americans do continue to believe in some version of the idea that we want journalism based on values like fact and transparency and oversight. And what he was doing there was he was trying to correct a previously viral study that had suggested that most Americans had abandoned those principles. This previous study was interpreted to suggest that maybe Americans just don't care about fact and transparency anymore by and large. And as it turned out, I think Benton shows quite convincingly that the study had designed and interpreted the survey data in highly problematic ways. This, of course, is also a microcosm of how misinformation travels, right? It's very likely that it is this headline that will get a lot more exposure than the correction ever will. And Benton's point here is that this is part of our mistrust porn, this temptation to think that nobody cares about the fact anymore, something has changed. We live in this Mad Max post-apocalypse where the ruins of science and philosophy sink under the sand dunes. What I don't want to do here, though, is I don't just want to flip this flawed lens the other way. I don't want to suggest that we don't have any problem with the facts. We most certainly do, right? And Francesca has shown that in one way. And I think what I want to add on to that here is maybe the problem isn't necessarily that people are saying, screw the fact, right? Our information ecosystem is characterized not simply by the land of fact and the land of fake fact, but there's a more variegated crisis of what we think even looks and sounds and smells like the fact. And again, when Francesca relays the research that she's done around people and why they search for Google and what they expect to find and why they reject the news media, we again see this kind of very strong, I think, strong relationship, a very emotional relationship that we still have with the idea of fact and reason. And that's the thing that I want to focus on here today. So the problem, I think, one of the problems that we have isn't, rather than just saying people reject the fact or people don't know facts when they're looking at them in the when they're staring at them in the face. Rather than that, maybe the problem is that some of the most influential epicenters of misinformation and confusion, that's exactly where we see the language of speaking fact and exercising reason. These are some of the actors. The same people who spread this information, for example, often tend to be the same people that say, I am for fact and reason, and this is what they look like, and try to own those words and own those concepts. And this is something that I'll go on to call fact signaling. So it's this idea of doing your own research with all its heroic imagery of the transgressive, street smart lone wolf. It's the idea of speaking the truth that experts and masses are apparently too scared to say. Now, it's important to note that this is not at all the same as actually conducting research or actually being factual in exactly what you say, right? Those two things are not the same. But it is this idea of fact and reason, often steeped in a very selective imagination of science or modernity or journalism, that supplies the affective allure of engaging with this information. It's the sense that I know what is happening. I know how the world is supposed to work at a time when it feels like nothing around us is working at all. So to ground all of this a little bit, let me provide one example from my ongoing research. One thing that I'm looking at here is essentially, I think there's an uncanny resonance between these two images, these two quite famous slogans. On one hand, we have the slogan made famous during the Trump rallies, fuck your feelings. And then on the other hand, we have the self-appointed slogan of the well-known conservative commentator Ben Shapiro, facts don't care about your feelings. So on the right, we have this kind of sharpened marketing slogan that harkens to the idea that facts are, cool, inhuman, objective things, but also they're being wielded in a very aggressive and combative way, right? The facts don't care about you. If you can't accept them, you deserve every scorn and disrepute. But all of this shares, I think, a lot more than it would admit with its more outspoken neighbor on the left, this affective critiqueur of fuck your feelings, in which being able to attack and dismiss the feelings of the other becomes a source of triumph and pleasure and a sense of certainty, this idea that the facts are on my side and I know where to get those facts. So I go into some of these details in this recent book chapter, but the key here is that what influencers like Shapiro do so well is they dress up a lot of familiar, often decades old political talking points they are able to dress this up as a heroic defense of fact and reason and transparency and objectivity and these kinds of values that, again, very few of us would say that we oppose or we don't care about. Shapiro's performances constantly emphasize how he and his listeners are the last bastion of fact and reason against what he calls a radical left world that privileges mushy feelings. Shapiro presents himself as a Harvard Law School prodigy, borrowing a sense of legitimacy from the same elite universities that he regularly attacks. He's also successfully roped in the mainstream media into covering him this way, with the New York Times once calling him a cool kid philosopher and providing him with this kind of priceless visibility and legitimacy. But what's really interesting here, what's really crucial here, is the work of affective solidarity in invoking words like fact and reason. There is a lot of iconography and a lot of symbols floating around here that are tying the idea of fact and reason to a very selective imagination of Western modernity as the best of humanity, progress as the truth of history, reason as a heroic exercise of aggressive debating skills. It's this idea, as you can see here on one of Ben Shapiro's books, the idea that they're on the right side of history, symbolized by this pseudo-Olympic flame that illuminates a dark planet with reason and morality of the West. So my point here is that we can see a certain network of affective pleasure tied up with what they would, what someone like Shapiro would advertise is simply the exercise of cold, impersonal reason. It is the pleasure of being able to say, fact don't care about your feelings, which is implicitly to say that the facts support my feelings. As Lauren Berlant puts it, we can often handle a lot of incoherence in our lives, as long as we feel that there are some stable anchors for sense-making, what Francesca referred to, similar to what she referred to in terms of deep stories about the world around us. And I think that connection between the kinds of deep stories we try to use to navigate our world and the language of fact and reason that we use is the really critical link in play here. A telling point towards this affective understanding is if we look at the actual content of influences like Shapiro or others that Rebecca Lewis's research calls the alternative influence network, this kind of content, they usually spend a lot more time talking about how they are for fact and reason and very little time actually conducting any kind of research or analysis. So there, for example, there's very little sign of the idea that e.g. scientific inquiry involves constantly updating your hypotheses, in which what we know is never final and we must always question our own premises. Not so much of that, right? Rather, this kind of content tends to parasitically feed on the mainstream media that they criticize, who are then, as you can see here, destroyed, debunked, or crushed for their unreason. It's kind of a constantly renewing highlight reel of victory laps. And this gets to the heart of what I call fact signaling. It is a weaponization of the idea of fact and reason, which again is not necessarily connected to any substantial engagement with data or research or science or philosophy. Rather, the primary aim here is to keep this highlight reel going, to continue to churn out content that cultivates a kind of affective solidarity. The idea that we are on the right side of history, we don't have to doubt ourselves, and we have a way to establish some basis of certainty for navigating our social and political lives. So for me, there's an essential connection in this off-kilter resonance between fuck your feelings and facts don't care about your feelings. And it reflects this ongoing uncertainty, ongoing effort to appropriate the kind of cultural associations around what do we think looks like the fact? What do we think looks like the truth? After we search on Google, how do we click on what? And then how do we make our own assessment of what we click on? What kind of heuristics are we bringing along with us for saying this person looks trustworthy or this person looks like the untrustworthy mainstream media, so on and so forth? But I think this kind of fact signaling also reflects a broader disjuncture, something that is not unique to a particular political domain like the American right. I think it reflects a wider instability, a disjuncture between, on one hand, the broader legitimacy that we still give to the abstract idea of fact, reason, objectivity, transparency. We still love these words. We still put a lot of cultural capital into them. On the other hand, we have a deep crisis around how those values are actually supposed to be enacted, what they're supposed to actually look like. And this is encapsulated in the fact that the idea of doing your own research has become an incredibly dangerous or an incredibly uncertain phrase, right? This is an oft-cited example, but we only need to think of the example of the Charleston mass killer who wrote in his manifesto that he became radicalized to violence when he started searching Black on white crime on Google. So in some of my other work, like my book, Technologies of Speculation, I make the broader argument that a lot of these troubles that we have around what facts look like is they're connected to this continued assumption we have of the good liberal subject. The continued assumption we have that people process information rationally, somewhat like machines, which is an imagination that equates people with computers and computers with people that goes back through pretty much our entire history of these technologies. The assumption that if we feed people with information, data, that people will process that rationally to arrive at more or less factual conclusions. And this is the kind of specter that continues to haunt the way we think about journalistic norms or arguments about transparency or fact-checking. We've seen this with what Whitney Phillips has called the oxygen of amplification, which is when the media covers QAnon or anti-vaxxers under the idea that we've got to inform the public about these things and more information is generally better. That can be true, but it can also risk giving these fringe groups a crucial route to visibility and legitimacy. And we now know through the work of folks like Francesca, John Donovan, we know that a lot of these fringe groups see the mainstream media coverage, even critical coverage, as a really useful route for them to recruit new audiences. So the point here is that transparency or providing data or providing information or fact-checking, it can never really do the job on its own, and it can sometimes backfire, right? It depends on, we need a robust information environment that can guide and shepherd the meaning of new information. And that's sort of the opposite of the information ecosystem we have right now. That's the opposite of the data-driven platforms that we have right now, right? The changes that are being made, the changes that Google or Facebook are making along with their platforms doesn't really help us get there. So maybe to sum it all up, for me, I think the trouble is that a lot of the time, information also compels speculation, and we don't have the right tools in our digital environment, in our platform governed environment for dealing with some of these accompaniments. So I want to end here with something from the anthropologist Mary Douglas that has actually stayed with me. She raises a very tongue-in-cheek question. She says, don't people understand that the more complicated, in-depth information we provide to the public, the more opportunities for misinformation and speculation? Now, we have to be careful. Her argument is not to say, let's go back to when only the priest could read the Bible, because that is no solution in many ways. Rather, I think the important lesson here, and this is a shift that many researchers are already helping us make, and we have to continue to make, we can't just ask who is loyal to the fact and who is not, who knows how to see the fact and who doesn't. It's not just a literacy problem or an education problem. I think the key problem that we're starting to ask is, what emotional, cultural, ritual practices are emerging in different communities to generate their institution of certainty? How should journalists or researchers position themselves when everybody agrees that the facts matter more than ever, but it is far less clear as to what the hell the facts look like anyway, and the people that speak them? So with those perhaps impossible to answer questions, I'm going to be very irresponsible and stop here and hand it over to Kevin. Thank you.
And again, just a very quick reminder, please, if you've got questions, throw them in the Q&A and we'll get to them after Kevin gets done with his presentation. Over to you, Kevin.
Thanks. I'm not a professor, so I don't have slides, but I do have, I'm not as smart as either of the presenters you have just heard from, but I will try to offer some observations in the form of shifts that I'm observing. My column at the Times is called The Shift, and so I decided I would just jot down a few of the kind of changes that I'm observing as a reporter who follows the information wars and the media ecosystem fairly closely, along with a number of my colleagues at the New York Times. And I'll just start with the general sort of impression that I have, which is that it's so nice and heartening that we're even having these kinds of conversations. Several years ago, when I started really covering sort of social media misinformation, online extremism, the number of people who really understood and studied and sort of had made, bona fide good faith attempts to kind of wrestle with some of these issues and trade-offs probably could have fit, in a small Zoom. And now we've got tons of people who are doing this really, really important work. And so it's just been wonderful to watch this whole field really develop. And I have many more potential sources that I can call now for expertise on these issues than I used to have, which is a nice thing. So the first shift that I'm thinking about right now and looking at is the shift from public to private. And what I mean by that is that a lot of the sort of domestic extremists that we're seeing, a lot of these sort of sources of mis and disinformation that we've grown used to over the past several years are either being banned or kind of self-ejecting from major platforms, from major broadcast platforms like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. And they are moving onto private messaging apps like Telegram and Signal. And I think there are ways to look at this. There's sort of the optimistic take and the pessimistic take on this. The sort of pessimistic take on this is that, once these conversations, once these sort of radicalization efforts move from public spaces where journalists, researchers, law enforcement can look at them and track them and study them, and once those move into private spaces, that becomes much harder. And so that's one thing that you're seeing some grappling with among journalists and researchers. We have this incredible corpus of data about online radicalization right now because it's all been happening out in the open on platforms that by and large are fairly searchable. So we are moving from a world of a lot of data to a world in which data is going to be very hard to come by, and it's going to be, gotten through, leaks and archives and whistleblowers, and not necessarily through going onto, Facebook.com and typing in, neo-Nazis and finding the big neo-Nazi page. The optimistic take on the sort of public to private shift is that I've been thinking about it in sort of like an epidemiological model, where I think if you're worried about sort of the hardened extremists and disinformation, campaign runners, sort of radicalizing each other and sort of becoming more hardened and extreme in private spaces, I think that's one thing. But the thing that I actually worry more about is the sort of contagion of these ideas, the sort of infiltration of extremists and movements like QAnon into spaces where people are not explicitly seeking that stuff out. So, QAnon conspiracy theorists joining parenting groups, or anti-vax conspiracy theorists joining natural health groups and sort of seeding those ideas in through the back door that way. And so moving from public to private spaces cuts way down on that sort of contagion risk. It's almost like taking someone who's sick and moving them out of a crowded stadium and into a sick ward at a hospital. There's a lot more virus going around in that sick ward, but they're less likely to infect non-infected people. And so that's something that I'm thinking a lot about. I'm also thinking about this shift from information that is distributed by AI to information that is created by AI. Right now, I think we are probably already in a world or close to a world in which the majority of the content that is being sort of put online on any given day is being generated by machine learning and not by humans. And that is going to radically accelerate in the next few years. We've already seen things like GPT-3, which is the large language model built by OpenAI that is sort of being commercialized as we speak, that can kind of generate very realistic text. And so what we're going to see is a kind of like computerized propaganda machine that is sort of spinning up, that is being distributed. And actually one of our jobs as journalists will be to kind of be the Turing test almost, to say like this story that you're reading was actually not written by a human, that was written by an AI. There are going to be sort of AI assisted disinformation campaigns that will use things like GPT-3 to push out millions of false and misleading stories in just a fraction of the time it would take humans. So I think we've here until this point we've sort of been grappling with kind of very crude forms of automated propaganda, so like Twitter bots, we've seen some of, but I think what we're moving into is a world of much more sophisticated AI that's capable of producing content that you or I or our family members or friends might come across and never know was written by an algorithm. I'm thinking about the shift from mass misinformation to niche misinformation. I think one consequence of this platform reckoning that Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and all the other major social networks have sort of undergone in the past several years is that it's much harder to achieve massive scale if you have a sort of overt disinformation campaign or conspiracy theory community or violent extremist group. So instead, what I'm seeing and what my colleagues are seeing is that these operations, these groups, these sort of attempts, whether by a state or by a partisan actor domestically, they are sort of segmenting themselves into various niches. The way that a consumer brand might sell one energy drink targeted at athletes, and another one targeted at gamers, and another one targeted at moms who are buying them for their kids, and another one targeted at dads. I mean, it's sort of a market segmentation of misinformation that's being sort of tailored to smaller, more niche communities, and maybe it's not going through a big central feed and getting millions of views. Maybe it's getting 10,000 views in one group, 20,000 views in another group, and it's sort of racking up popularity in these kind of smaller units, but is still being influential and confusing people and disorienting them. Among journalists and researchers and platforms, I'm thinking about the shift from debunking to pre-bunking. One of the things that we have noticed at the Times and I know across the industry is that by the time we have our fact checks written, it's generally very hard and time consuming to fact check a lot of disinformation. And so that's why there aren't that many places that do it, and it's pretty resource intensive. It requires picking up the phone, calling the Board of Elections, saying, is this voting machine really malfunctioning and switching votes from one party to another? It's much slower than actually creating the original piece of disinformation, and it is much less resource efficient. So I think what we're going to start seeing, and what we've already started to see, is this idea of pre-bunking, of sort of anticipating what groups might do to try to spin a piece of new information, to try to sort of, cast doubt on an election outcome or the effectiveness of a vaccine. And we're going to start seeing more proactive attempts to sort of anticipate that and get ahead of it and kind of give people sort of almost inoculate people against the misinformation that they're likely to see in their feeds and on their homepages. And so we've already seen some of this. I mean, Facebook and other social platforms have had massive efforts around vaccine safety. and messaging about the effectiveness of vaccines. And so they didn't really wait until vaccines were available and being distributed to do that, because they could anticipate. We've seen this enough times to know sort of the rhythm and the cadence of it. And so they knew it was coming. They put information out there in people's information panels before a lot of the misinformation was out there. And hopefully we're able to sort of dissuade some people from believing, from becoming vaccine hesitant or skeptical because they encountered something false. I'm thinking about a shift that I'm calling from Macedonian teens to mega donors with memes. In the 2016 election, famously, there was a sort of cottage industry of sort of clickbait misinformation coming out of sort of these Macedonian troll farms that were operating for profits, some of them run by teenagers, getting millions and millions of views on stories about how the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump, or Hillary Clinton had come out as a lesbian or something like that. And I think what we're seeing now, those sort of for-profit, foreign-run sort of content shops have been mostly sort of prevented from making as much money. It's not nearly as profitable. And so I think what we're seeing now is an effort to sort of fund misinformation and propaganda the way that lots of political communication is funded by very rich partisans. We're starting to see this with things like Parler, which has been funded in large part by Rebecca Mercer, who's a big conservative donor. We're seeing this on the left as well. Big donors are pumping money into sort of partisan Facebook pages and attempts to kind of set up parallel media ecosystems for something like Breitbart on the left. So I think we're moving into a much more sort of centrally funded media ecosystem, especially when it comes to these hyper-partisan sources. I'm thinking about the shift from talking about platform decisions to talking about platform architecture. Right now, a lot of the conversation about Facebook and Twitter is about sort of individual decisions they make. Why did they pull down this thing and not that thing? Why are they letting this person post or tweet or upload videos, but not this other person? And that will obviously continue to happen, but I think there's going to be a much more mature conversation developing around platform architecture, why these algorithms work the way they do, why it's much more effective to combat misinformation at the architecture level, where you can tweak one thing and have it sort of flow downstream to millions of pieces of content, than it is to kind of play the whack-a-mole game and go around fact-checking post by post. And so I think that's a shift that I'm actually excited about, because I think the whack-a-mole game is not only exhausting for people, I don't actually think it's very effective in the long run. And then the last shift I'm thinking about, at least that I could think of before this panel, is the shift in goals among partisan extremists, from radicalizing normies to normalizing radicals. And what I mean by that is there has been this sort of attempt over the past 5 or 6 or 7 years to radicalize normies, to take people who are not extremists and to turn them into extremists, to sort of red pill them from their previous set of political beliefs into a new set of political beliefs that are more extreme or more conspiratorial or more violent or more racist. And I think what we're starting to see now is this attempt to kind of go in the other direction, to take people with very extreme views and to kind of whitewash those views and sort of stuff them into a box of legitimacy and prop them up and get them into power. And I think we're seeing this begin with people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congresswoman from Georgia. She is an influencer before she is a politician. She was a YouTube person. She really was building a career as not only a QAnon believer, but a QAnon influencer. She was trying to get her YouTube channel and her Instagram posts to blow up. So she was really a case where she was already kind of steeped in the language of internet extremism and conspiracy theories. And then she's sort of been slowly sort of downplaying those beliefs and trying to adopt a veneer of kind of mainstream Republican legitimacy. I don't know how well that's working for her, but it's definitely the tactic has been to kind of take people from these internet extremist communities and sort of dress them up as mainstream politicians, or at least mainstream enough. And so that's something I think we'll see a lot more of in the coming years. So that's what I have. I'm happy to answer any questions. As I said, the other people in this Zoom are much smarter than I am, so you'll probably want to direct your questions at them, but thanks for having me. This is fun.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I have to start actually. I actually would like. I'm slightly terrified by what all three of you have said in this session. Kevin, when you mentioned the coming wave of computerized propaganda machinery that make the Twitter bot armies look crude and small potatoes, thinking about Francesca talking about the incredibly creative, clever people who are mastering strategic keyword signaling, and thinking about Sun Ha talking about the incredibly clever people mastering fact signaling. I'm filled with a lot of a sense of doom. Like they said, we don't have a prayer in hell, us average folks, to stand up against this. And so I just want to actually ask all three of you, are we doomed? And like, is there any hope here in what you're describing? We are up against incredibly clever, smart people who are using technology and using algorithms and using their sense of language and rhetoric, and in the wonderful phrase of Sun Ha, basically trolling us with the Enlightenment. One of my new favorite phrases. Are we doomed?
Who wants to start? Okay, I guess that's me, opening my mouth and all that. But I'm a very bad person to ask that question, because I think all of my work, whether it's with AI or with this, is generally pessimistic in a lot of ways. But I think one kind of way to historically put this in context is, of course, and a lot of people have said this, of course, is we have never lived in a world where facts were just facts and people trusted the journalists on everything or trusted the scientists on everything, right? And Noortia Mars has written a great piece on this, and I think she had this great formulation. I'm paraphrasing here, but something like, she said, "I am struck by the convenient imagination of the past that relies on," right? This idea that we all used to have a stable set of facts that we used to run society, and we were all together until 2016 or 2012 or wherever you have you, and then Mark Zuckerberg broke everything. And you know, Mark Zuckerberg breaks a lot of things, but you know, let's not give him too much credit, right? We've always lived in a world where I think what looks and smells like fact have always been under contestation. And we know that historically, there's never been a point in time when the journalists working in the newsroom were able to all point to a single unified sense of the objective newsroom that was actually being practiced in a unified way across the country or across the globe, right? It's always been a kind of aspirational ideal. And I think for me, the conclusion from there isn't, oh, we have always been screwed. I think another way to draw the conclusion is it has always been about trying to carve out some sufficient degree of trust and cohesion, knowing that some kind of perfect grounding for that is never going to exist. And I think that allows us to understand that a lot of disinformation strategies And a lot of people that are peddling these strategies are also in just as fragile ground as the people who are trying to fact check or to report on these things. They are, you know, there is no Q that is in control of the narrative and is able to completely control their adherents and so on and so forth, right? They are in the dogfight as well. And there is a lot of fragility and anxiety in those communities as well, whether it's the Macedonian farms or the mega donors, around what kind of language they can use and what's going to backfire and what is going to catch wind in the sails. So I think it is recognizing that moment of possibility in which the kind of measures that especially Francesca and others have talked about can make a measurable impact, just that we can't necessarily think they're going to fix the problem and then we go back to not having a problem.
Francesca, what are your thoughts?
I don't think the future is
doomed?
I don't think we're doomed. So I would say there's a few things that I think a lot about. One is really being more mindful of how we start our inquiries to begin with, right? So I think so many of us go to search engines in particular, kind of thinking like, oh, they're the new library, and like whatever I put into it is just going to help me find out what I need to know. And they're not. They're these heavily curated systems that have no interest in like changing your mind or helping you find the real information, right? They are, I think Safai Noble's concept of how they're just really well disguised marketing firms, right? Like their goal is just to take as much about our data as possible and sell it to something else. And so I think the way that we could quote unquote have more control over this is like being more mindful of how we seek out information to begin with. Another thing I would like to just throw out there, and I think you know, Kevin's notion about this AI automated misinformation, and also you know, fact signaling as well. I think these are all interrelated, and I know that a lot of researchers are looking at are really looking at patterns of misinformation flows and how you can, I don't even know how to respond to this, like great trolling on a panel. And so like, how can you look at this stuff from patterns of misinformation? And so things that I know researchers are looking at is trafficking in keywords and ways that you can identify keywords that are associated with misinformation campaigns, and in some ways circumvent exactly what Kevin's talking about, right? With the automated misinformation.
Kevin, you talk in your book Futureproof about different strategies for future-proofing all of us against the onslaught of AI. But you talked about different kinds of jobs that'll be difficult for AI to replace. But how on earth can I future-proof myself against the power of YouTube's algorithms? And how can I future-proof myself against the power of those AI content producing farms that are going to seem so human-like? Just as my friend 4 years ago was tricked by that piece in the Boston Tribune, how on earth can we future-proof ourselves against in all the ever more sophisticated disinformation machine?
David, first of all, thank you for the book plug. I owe you one. And I'm thinking about this in a couple ways. I mean, I think that the way to answer your most narrow part of your question is how can you protect yourself against the YouTube algorithm? There's a little toggle on YouTube where you can say autoplay next video or don't autoplay next video. If you turn that off, you are immune from at least that part of the recommendation system where it autoplays the next video that after the one you're watching is finished. And I actually have done that myself, because I just find if I don't, I just end up 3 hours later completely in a dissociative fugue state watching, videos of, I don't know, people making tiny hamburgers or something. I don't know. I end up in the weirdest places on YouTube. But I think the sort of larger thing, I don't love the term media literacy, because it sort of implies that there's kind of one correct way to sort of read media. and that if we just tell everyone how to read media, like they'll get it, and there will be no more wrong facts, and everyone will be on the same page. But I think the concept that I prefer is what I call digital discernment, which is just sort of understanding systems and architecture of platforms, and sort of understanding the ways in which you are being manipulated, not so that you can necessarily opt out of it, but so that you can just understand the way that things are flowing to you, that what's going to you is not on Google is not just the most relevant, accurate, search box, teaching people how PageRank works, how newsfeed works, how YouTube recommendation algorithms work, so that there's sort of awareness. And I actually think you're starting to see this. One thing that makes me hopeful is when I see like people who are much younger than me interact with sort of automated content ranking systems. They really get it. Like they've been steeped in this their whole lives. And so on TikTok, sometimes you'll see like people saying like, I don't know how I got into puppy TikTok algorithm, or I wish my algorithm don't see this, because they're like in the comments, they're like, I don't want this to count toward my like algorithmic persona. And so I think there's a really sort of innate understanding among people who are in their sort of teens and early 20s about sort of the architecture of the platforms that serve them information. And so I think that's getting better, and that sort of makes me a little bit hopeful.
We have a terrific question from a member of the audience that I'd love to put to you. And the question is, do you think that the efforts to fight misinformation and extremism could end up undermining the free speech or privacy rights of regular Americans?
Is that a question for me?
Sure, why not? I'll start with you, unless someone has a brilliant idea. But is that a possibility? We've seen concerns being raised, for example, with the removal of folks from being deplatformed, and obviously the blocking of Trump's Twitter account. And there's even some questions about the libel suits that were recently brought against Fox News by Dominion voting systems. There's a kind of a growing drumbeat of concern that, well, what if all this stuff ends up boomeranging in some strange way that ultimately ends up hurting the very thing that we're trying to help?
It could certainly happen. I mean, I think we have to, I don't know, there's a lot of traps to fall into with this discussion. I think worrying about sort of over policing misinformation is like, I think about it sort of like worrying about like overpopulation on Mars or something. Like maybe it's a theoretical problem that we'll run into someday, but like we're nowhere close to it now. And so I think that, I worry about free speech. I'm a journalist. Like, I don't love the concept that like, Mark Zuckerberg's deciding what people can or can't say. But I think that I prefer to analyze things on the level of architecture and systems rather than individual content decisions. And so I think that, what we need to be doing as we develop new systems, and by we, I mean they, because I don't build algorithmic news distribution systems. But I think we need to be careful not to create too many sort of false positives when we're trying to detect things like hate speech and political misinformation. But I just don't think we're anywhere close to being overzealous on that.
If I can jump in
Sanha,
there.
do you have something to add there?
Yeah, I just backing on top of what Kevin says, I think one of the greatest traps that we have in all of these discussions is the difficulty of figuring out which concern or which danger, how do we prioritize that? And I think that often leads a lot of these discussions astray, because if we look around us, in all directions, there are these dangers and risks around anything that we do around this information. And the most important thing we can do is prioritize and say, what are the most important things to be concerned about, right? So, is it more appropriate to be concerned about, as Kevin says, overpopulation on Mars? And I think with this particular question, it comes down to, I think we ended up with a false dichotomy of either protecting this kind of absolutist vision of free speech, or the specter of some arbitrary authoritarian platform control, partly because of bad faith arguments, but also partly because the moderation and moderation systems that we have in place are inadequate and very ad hoc. So if you look at the kind of what appears to be kind of crowdsourced lynching of particular figures when they become extremely controversial, forcing Jack Dorsey or Mark Zuckerberg to pull the trigger on an individualized basis, then I think, of course, it raises these kinds of concerns. And I think if we had a more systematic set of moderation systems that were better funded instead of being criminally underfunded and undertreated, as Sarah T. Roberts has shown, and if it were not completely up to the whims of particular tech CEOs, but coming from government regulation and civil society, then we would have much less of a problem as to whether moderation is going to lead to terrible decisions killing free speech. So I think it comes down to it's being done in a really ad hoc and inadequate way right now that makes that overpopulation on Mars problem seem much bigger and much more present.
Mm. We have a question that I think
sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Just really quickly, I'd like to just also add to that conversation. I think we often conceptualize these spaces as the new public sphere, and they just really aren't. And we need to be more mindful of the fact that these are private organizations designed to sell our data. And so we already have no privacy when it comes to these tools and these platforms. And so perpetuating this narrative of free speech, I think, really misses the mark of these are corporations that you have agreed to terms of service to, and they can ultimately do whatever they want to with your information and with content moderation. And that in itself is, I think, something that's problematic.
Francesca, I wanted to ask you another question. It comes from the audience that I think it's absolutely in your wheelhouse. The question goes like this. It seems like any term or phrase that is created to describe problems in our information environment, such as fake news, quickly gets co-opted and applied to other things, such that the original meaning of the term gets either diluted or confounded in the public discourse. How do we handle these namespace collisions in ways where we can continue to communicate about the importance of facts and context to people who are willing to listen?
That's a great question. I think the notion of namespace collisions is really relevant and important. It's something I actually talk about in my dissertation and in my book, thinking about how something even like Black Lives Matter gets co-opted into Blue Lives Matter, and the way that then creates these competing traffics and Twitter handles, and these competing narratives around these small key phrases. One thing I also think a lot about is how this is historical, right? So the notion of creating a set of key words or phrases to change the conversation is something that political strategists have been doing since the 80s and the 90s, right? There's a lot of the things that we're seeing now are strategies that Lee Atwater used, or strategies that Frank Luntz used. And so I think really just this asymmetrical understanding of how information flows. But in terms of how to combat it, one thing I think is really relevant is thinking about how you tag information. And something I think journalists can think a lot about is how are they tagging their stories in ways to make sure that their information rises to the top of search engines as well. Because oftentimes these key words and phrases are created in order to drive traffic away from the narrative. And so making sure, understanding, I guess, the politics of platforms and the politics of search, I think can help us combat misinformation and disinformation order.
One quick question I would have for all three of you. One of the things we hear over and over again in these conversations really is about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And people are always sort of saying, if only we got rid of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, that would make a huge difference in this space. And for those of you who don't know, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act basically gives the platforms immunity from the content that they're putting on, from libel, defamation, things like that. Do you, I guess, to Kevin, coming to you on this, because this is kind of an architectural question, right? It's a structural question. And you talked about that shift from sort of the whack-a-mole approach to something that has a greater kind of structural impact on the entire ecosystem that we've been talking about. Do you think that changing Section 230 would have much of an impact on this conversation about the spread of disinformation?
I mean, it would have a huge impact on lots of things. I mean, every social platform would either, radically overhaul its business. It would be hugely disruptive, and I'm not sure it would be a good thing net. It would introduce new problems. I do like the approach that a few Democrats in Congress have proposed, which is to sort of carve out a piece of Section 230 for amplification, for algorithmic amplification, so that platforms, they would still be free from liability for content that is user generated, but they would not be free from liability for their decisions to promote or boost certain content through recommendations, through page suggestions, that would force them to essentially move to a model where you had to kind of be approved in order to be eligible to be recommended and sort of boosted through the viral mechanics of the platforms. I actually think that could be quite an interesting approach.
Somehow, what do you think?
I am going to opt out of that one just because I know a little bit about Section 230, but I think Section 230 in particular, there's been a problem where everybody's piling on talking about it. And I think I want to refer people to folks like Kate Klonick, who are actual experts in that area.
Francesca, do you have a thought?
No, I like Shah. I think I agree. I would like to defer to the legal experts with 230. I do think it is interesting, though, that it is at the crux of most of these. It intertwines often with this notion of protecting free speech. And those are actually not the same thing. So I think it's important not only for us to have a better understanding of what 230 is designed to do, which is whether or not it's classifying platforms as distributors or producers. I mean, is the crux of 230 is like, are you a distributor of information or are you a creator of information? And I think it's being co-opted into whether or not it should moderate content, and like content moderation based on terms of service is different than what much of what 230 is. And I would say it's a similar strategy that was used in order to reframe what we meant by objectivity. So like objectivity didn't mean report both sides of an argument, right? It came to mean objectivity when mainstream media was under attack in like the 1950s for being deemed quote unquote too liberal. So I think that it's often like we use these, the fairness doctrine or 230 are often weaponized and exploited because we don't really know 100% of like what they mean and what they're doing.
Well, we've come to the end of our allotted time. I wish we hadn't, because I have about another 4 hours of questions to ask each of you. But I wanted to thank the three of you, first of all, for giving us this time and these great insights. And I also want to thank our audience for joining us. And I also want to thank Marion and her team for doing such a fabulous job in setting this up. It's been a great conversation. I don't feel completely reassured, but I definitely feel like I understand it a little bit better. So thank you, all three of you, for joining us today. And with that, we're going to sign off.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, David. Thanks, everyone.